Hey everyone, this is Nick and welcome to the last episode of the Linux and open source news for 2023. Obviously we're coming back next year, don't worry. And this week we have Nate Graham from KDE basically dismantling the infamous Wayland breaks everything blog post and everything that's being built around it. And he also explains why X11 is a terrible platform to try and build anything on. We also have a look at why free and open source licenses are just not enough in the modern world and full of loopholes, and we have more AI related regulation, this time in the US, asking for more transparency on the data being used to train those various models. And we also have this segue to our sponsor. If you're a Linux user and you're planning to replace your current computer, whether it's a desktop or laptop, stop buying devices from the big name hardware manufacturers that only support Windows. Buy something from a manufacturer that actually supports Linux and contributes to its development, like Tuxedo, our sponsor. Tuxedo has a very wide range of devices, from laptops, ultrabooks, gaming laptops, desktops, towers, NUCs, everything. Everything is customizable, you can have your own logo on the lid of your laptop, you can choose the components, you can have your own keyboard layout, and basically you know that Linux is going to run on that because that's what it ships with. You can pick from a selection of popular distros, or you can just slap your own and just use your computer as is with the distro of your choice. And if Tuxedo encountered some problems during their testing, they actually submit patches upstream to try and fix all these issues. Plus, all the laptops can be opened, repaired, and upgraded. So if you need a new computer, you're a Linux user, and you want to support Linux's development, click the link in the description below and get yourself a computer from Tuxedo. Okay, so Nate Graham of KDE Plasma fame posted a blog post this week where he addresses concerns about Wayland and explains why X11 isn't something we can keep using. And it's a very interesting read, no matter on which side of the issue you're on. So first he addresses the semi-recent Wayland breaks everything blog post, infamous for containing plenty of false claims and a very strange perspective that boils down to Wayland should be a direct copy of X11, which obviously doesn't make sense. Nate also addresses the recent GitHub repo created by the same person who wrote the blog post, who is also one of the main developers for app images. This repo has been set in place to try and add protocols for Wayland that would replicate features that X11 has, but the Wayland protocol didn't implement, generally for security reasons. Now, obviously, this approach will never work, as these new add-on protocols would not be part of the standard, and so could not be relied upon by app developers, since not everyone would have access to them. It is something that is apparently pretty amusing to most Linux and desktop-related developers, and if you want to know more about this and why it can never work and it's a terrible idea in terms of implementation, Brody Robertson has a video on that exact topic. I left a link to it in the description of the video. Now, obviously, all of this work from the app image dev is looking at things from the wrong end of the telescope. They're thinking in terms of Wayland breaks everything, instead of realizing that it is apps that need to support the new Wayland protocols. And I'm saying new, but most of those protocols aren't even new at all. The apt comparison used in Nate's blog post is Linux breaks Photoshop, which obviously no one thinks like that. We all know it's a problem of Adobe not porting Photoshop to Linux. Same goes for Wayland, developers need to port their apps. Wayland is not a drop-in replacement for X11, and it was never intended to be that. Nate then moves to explaining why X11 was a bad platform to begin with its own terrible UI toolkit that broke things constantly and looked horrendous as well, which led to the creation of Qt and GTK, which led to fragmentation in terms of how apps look. And the conclusion of the post is that Linux is not the platform, something I also pointed out in a video a while back. No one develops a Linux app. People develop a KDE app, a GNOME app, an Elementary app based on a specific UI toolkit and framework. The real underlying platform nowadays is Wayland, Pipewire, and Portals, because they are the entire set of APIs that provide all the features an application needs. There are ways to interact safely with the file system, to send notifications, to print, to drag and drop stuff, to use the correct theme or the correct accent color, plus the audio system and a way to display windows, desktops, and to manage them. And I think Nate is right on the money here. Like, definitely this is the new platform that app developers are targeting, and those that aren't should definitely start targeting that. It's basically our Linux app development SDK, and then you pick a toolkit that you prefer and you work with that. And yes, we also do need a specific name for this platform because Pipewire plus Wayland plus Portals is a mouthful. I talked recently about Ubuntu's plans to focus on a more recent feature set for their x86 architecture support, which would exclude 8 to 10-year-old CPUs from being supported. Well, Phoronix has the benchmarks to see if that cutoff would be worth it for people who have newer CPUs that would potentially have better performance if everything was built using those more recent features. And it looks like there are definitely performance benefits for at least server-related use cases. Some workloads are absolutely much faster when using an Ubuntu build made for the V3 of the x86-64 architecture. But it's also limited to a small subset of use cases, like when the CPU is under heavy load or when using graphical intensive tasks that aren't GPU accelerated. And it remains to be seen what Ubuntu will actually do with that. Will they maintain a V3 version of all packages and a more backwards compatible version, which would be a lot of work? Will they drop older CPUs? Will they keep things as they are right now? We don't really know, but while there are some performance gains, I am not personally sure that they are big enough to justify cutting off people from having access to one of the most used distros and something that is also the base for a lot of other distributions. Now this week we also got the release of Nobara 39. It's still Fedora based and it still packs everything a gamer might want to have access to on Linux, but it does have one major change. It moved from GNOME as the default to KDE. And the reasons are many. First, KDE supports variable refresh rate and FreeSync natively, while GNOME needs patches for that. KDE also supports DRM leasing, something required for VR gaming, and that GNOME hasn't fully finished yet. Plus, KDE better supports fractional scaling, and SteamOS uses KDE, which means that in the future it might see gaming-focused patches which GNOME will not get. Now, apart from that, Nobara gets the latest NVIDIA drivers, they have a few new patches for their OBS Studio version to better support Wayland. The Welcome app got some options to allow for adding fixes to DaVinci Resolve and some Steam games. The Steam package should now yield better performance and better compatibility. Nobara moved to DNF5, 2 versions earlier than what Fedora is planning to do, which might introduce some stability problems, and Chromium is now the default browser instead of Firefox, which is one change I can't quite agree with. In virtually every single performance test that has been done comparing Nobara to other Linux distros or even Nobara to Windows 11, Nobara gets better performance with a lot of games compared to everything else. And it does come with all the tools that you might want to get started with Linux gaming. You don't have to research anything or download anything, it's all there right off the bat. So if you plan to game on Linux, it's probably still your best bet. And now with KDE, you also get better support for some interesting features related to gaming. Now, Gentoo announced that they will now provide a lot more binary packages in their repos to be used with their Portage package manager. If you don't know, Gentoo generally provides source packages that you then compile with the various flags you want, that are best suited to your exact CPU so you can squeeze all the performance you have from your hardware and also to give you more control over what you install. And of course, this also means that generally installing packages on Gentoo can take ages, depending on the complexity and size of the app or the library you're installing, and on the power you have access to on your computer. And so Gentoo already had a few binary packages, but now they have more than 20 gigs of packages on their mirrors, with stuff like LibreOffice, Plasma, GNOME, Docker, and more. So for giant apps or desktops or libraries that would take 8 to 24 hours to compile on your computer, you can now save a lot of time at the expense of optimization and a bit of control. I think it's a very worthy trade-off for a lot of less powerful hardware and a lot of big projects, like for example try to compile Chromium. Good luck with that. Now, it looks like Firefox will also get its own AI toolbox, much like every other web browser is trying to, but of course, since it's Mozilla, they're looking at it differently. They're building something called Memory Cache, which is an add-on for Firefox that uses private GPT. This means that you're just training a local AI with your own browser history and other local files you might want to give to it, like maybe your bookmarks or favorites or even PDFs. Everything is done locally, nothing is shared to a big model or a giant cloud, and the AI will use idle compute time to try and generate insights about what you've been reading. It is an experimental project still, it's still being worked on, but it's an interesting take on the whole AI thing. Instead of trying to replace search entirely with a bot that gives one single answer that is often insufficient or inaccurate, this thing would maybe link you to more resources on a particular topic, or help you sum up what you have read on this topic specifically. Everything looks like it's built to be private, which is a nice plus, because other AIs tend to be privacy nightmares. The project is open source, and I'm interested to see if it can be helpful to maybe summarize all the research you're doing or to suggest other information sources to help you reach your own conclusions. And it is always, and I mean always, better to research stuff yourself using multiple sources instead of relying on something like ChatGPT to pre-digest an answer that is probably either completely inaccurate or insufficient for your purposes. So I think this approach to AI is actually pretty cool. Although whether Mozilla should focus on trying to build an AI add-on or trying to make sure that Firefox actually survives the coming years is a different topic altogether. And still on AI, it looks like regulation is going to happen no matter what tech bros seem to think about its usefulness, as there's another proposed bill happening in the US. This one is called the AI Foundation Model Transparency Act, or AFMTA, and it would basically require creators of AI models to disclose the sources of the training data they used, so copyright holders can check if their stuff was used at that training stage. They will also have to disclose how the data is being retained and saved, and they also have to be clearer about the limitations or identified risks of their model and what computational power it's using to train the AI. Now, the developers will also need to report on their efforts to prevent the model from spitting out inaccurate or harmful information, notably about elections, financial decisions, medical help, and other things that are generally the source of very weird and dangerous conspiracy theories and misinformation. This bill still has to be passed, of course, so nothing's for certain yet, and it only affects the US, obviously, but it's still a step to try and check what information these tools will give to the general public as the one true answer. And it's easy to look at this as a big push from copyright holders and lobbyists to try to squeeze every single cent they can from every single new innovation. But if we look at it from maybe the side of open source or artists, we can see that GitHub Copilot, for example, pilfered open source repos, sometimes just copy-pastes entire snippets of code from what it grabbed from these open source repos, and it never gives any attribution or respects any of the licenses. Midjourney or Stable Diffusion have the capacity to completely plagiarize an artist's style, and there's no attribution for all the art that they've ingested to be able to do that. So it's not just copyright holders and lobbyists. I really think that this needs to be regulated separately because current copyright law just cannot cope with all of these new technologies. Now, that was an interesting look at open source and what comes after that, as our licenses don't seem to be fully adapted to the current world. Bruce Perens, one of the main impulsors of the open source movement, discussed that specific issue, saying that open source licenses are basically full of loopholes that are being exploited by many businesses. One of the examples they give is Red Hat, that sells open source software under the GPL without freely redistributing the source code and with license agreements putting restrictions on who can access or redistribute that source code, which is forbidden under the GPL terms. The other main issue is that open source failed to serve the general public. Perens says that most people use open source software through a proprietary OS and proprietary apps. The infrastructure is based on open source, but the means to access it and use it are not. And in turn, it means the common person isn't aware of open source, of free software, or of the freedoms that it guarantees them. He then goes on to imagine what could be put in place to fix that with something he calls post-open. This would imply a yearly compliance process that would check if the companies respect the principles of open source, and it would make businesses pay a fair amount to use open source software for their commercial products. That money then would be used to fund developers who write software targeted towards the general public. Now, all of this is obviously just wishful thinking. We don't really have any way to enforce any of that. But it's true that our licenses are getting regularly abused or distorted, or stuff is being built upon them to try and avoid complying with those, and it's definitely probably time that we reassessed how these work, or we updated them to handle stuff like AI using open source content, or just being able to add a contract or license agreement on top of that license that restricts it. I think we need to look at that in the future. Okay, so this will conclude this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't hesitate to like, to subscribe, to turn on notifications, or to write a comment. And if you didn't like it, there's always that dislike button and the comment section as well. And if you want to support the channel, there are plenty of links in the description to do just that for Patreon, LiberaPay, PayPal, YouTube memberships, YouTube thanks, whatever, you know how all of this works. So, thanks for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!